My name is Ellie Gold. I'm the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy. And here today we're going to have a conversation about the outlook for the Biden foreign policy. As we tend to have a notice over the years, it's very interesting what a candidate for president and what a president actually, in fact, does once they get into office. So the idea is now that President Biden has been in office for about a month now, the key is going to be to see to really assess what his foreign policy is going to look like. The Gold Institute, for those who are unfamiliar, is not an American think tank, but rather a think tank that focuses on the globe from a Western perspective, and that is from the idea of Western values and Western ideals. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's Europe and the United States, but we focus on those countries and those allies who value Western tradition and what we hold dear. So with that, I thought it would be a very interesting discussion today if we can take a look at the Biden foreign policy from an international perspective. Now, what makes the Gold Institute unique is the fact that our fellows are span the globe. So today, what I wanted to do was I wanted to ask Dr. Nahro Zagros, who resides in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, to join us to talk about his perspective, as we now see one of the key points of the Biden foreign policy is to renew relations, whatever that may look like, with Iran. So I think that having Nahro on the call is so important. And Nahro is a senior fellow at the Gold Institute. We have with us Derk Eppink. Derk is one of the founding members of the Gold Institute. He happens to be also a sitting member of European Parliament. He's an honorary distinguished fellow of the Gold Institute. He and I have been working for years on a number of different issues, and I thought that it would be important to get the European perspective of the outlook for the Biden foreign policy. And I am thrilled to have with us as well Congressman Darrell, who represents the 50th district in California. So I hope that there, by the time everybody's done moving from California to Texas, that there are 50 districts still left in California. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We're going to work things a little bit differently because each one of our speakers has a different schedule. One of our colleagues at the Gold Institute, Congressman Trent Franks, used to tell me that if I can get 2 members of Congress to their own funerals, that would be amazing. So now that we have a member of Congress and a member of Parliament, it makes things even that much more difficult. But I'm pleased to have everybody on the call. Those who are unfamiliar with the Congressman Issa, as I said before, represents the 50th district in California, is a senior member of the House Judiciary Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And from 2011 to 2015, he was the chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, which is during a consequential time in American history that you chaired that committee, and previously served in the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and Energy and Commerce. As a congressman and the leader of California grassroots level, the congressman has championed smart, limited government advanced legislation to balance the federal budget and promote transparency to hold government accountable to the people. Now, Congressman, that in the United States, I suspect, and Europe as well, which Derk can appreciate, holding government accountable is probably something that's, we're not very familiar with, but maybe you can so it's always good to have somebody on the call who is attempting to do that.
Well, first of all, organizations like the Gold Institute actually give us that opportunity to hold government accountable, because the most important thing about whether it's in the European Union or in the United States or in developing nations, transparency. And transparency isn't just data that you can look at and parliamentarians might be able to glean through. It's also being able to educate the public as to what the shortcomings of government are. And I've been honored to be able to do that in both high-profile cases like the IRS going after conservative groups, or the scandal of Benghazi, where we lost an ambassador and then there was a cover-up and the like, but also thousands of smaller ones in which the American people's money is poorly spent or people's rights are trampled on. I always find it interesting in the introduction when somebody says, balanced budget. I haven't done so well there, so we'll glean over, gloss over that part of my success story. But the subject for today, and the one that I think all of us on the call are acutely aware of, are a series of almost a universal, whatever Bush did, we're not going back to it. Whatever Trump did, we're going to do the reverse. And those policies, including essentially abandoning the Abraham Accords in favor of cozying up to Iran, changing the China policy, which also means changing our Japanese policy, our Taiwan policy, our Hong Kong policy. And as we go around the globe, almost without fail, it's whatever Trump did, let's do the opposite. And as we go through those, and all of the people on the call are going to, be able to name one after another of these, including the adverse effect, obviously, that the portion of Iraq that retain some semblance of democracy, the Kurdistan region, is going to experience. What I think is most important, though, is what is it that happens when you're somewhere on the globe and you see that one president to another and just a few electoral votes, 2 states, made the difference between one policy and a completely different policy? If you're in Israel, that tells you that not only do elections matter, but you cannot rely on or trust the United States, even when you have a president who has been as supportive of peace in the region as President Trump was. And if you're in Saudi Arabia, although I will comment that by sanctioning 18 officials, but not the Crown Prince, they didn't quite get it as badly as they could have in souring relations, but certainly a flip on how we're viewing Yemen and the region is a problem. But it only has one silver lining, and the silver lining is that some of our allies, and I'll just use the 2 I mentioned, Israel and Saudi Arabia, along with Egypt, Jordan, and all the other new members of the Abraham Accords, they know now that the work that was done under the Trump administration, they're going to have to continue without, and at times against, the efforts of this new Biden administration. And that's going to make for a very, very strange turn of events where I was with Secretary Pompeo over the weekend at CPAC. And, he is a good transition officer. He's doing what he's supposed to do. But, of course, he's fielding these calls from people that say, now what do I do? And on one hand, he cannot tell them what to do. And on the other hand, what they need to do is obvious, which is they need to form alliances that are very new to them, and they need to do it for the most part without State Department high-level support. Some of the very quickly, some of the most important ones that some people will like. They'll like getting back onto the Paris, climate accords and re-entering the World Health Organization without any reforms. But I don't think anyone on this call is going to look and say, telling China basically that we're giving up on any kind of support for freedom and human rights, pushback against China's activities, dealing with Myanmar and trying to say we're not doing the same thing. Of course, if you reverse trends at all, you're going to have genocide. And we're seeing that in the Horn of Africa. So I know that everyone here kind of knows it, but I want to leave and take questions if appropriate. I want to leave with the items like the need for strikes and a back and forth in the Iranian missiles and Syria while cozying up to Iran. That's just the first of what's going to be dozens of examples where Iran or China or Russia is going to test this administration. And what you're going to see is you're going to see more violence, more testing, and more proof that because Biden didn't get anything in return, you're going to find that there's going to be instability. That includes Afghanistan, where obviously it was never all that good a deal with the Taliban, but now it's not going to be a deal at all, but rather you've agreed to leave, and we're certainly not going to see any kind of compliance with any of the agreements. So I'll stop there and see if there's anything that people want to ask specifically from a either congressional standpoint or some of the other regions in a smaller, more micro way.
So thank you for your comments. Let me ask you before we move on to questions. But let me ask you: is there a clear path forward for stability in the Middle East? President Trump, I think, was very successful. I know I spent years working on an Arab NATO. President Trump, kudos to him, did something very un-Washingtonian, which is rather than trying to get everybody to the table, focused on one country at a time, and naturally others followed suit. So kudos to President Trump for taking an outsider's view on that. That being said, is it possible to reestablish relations with Iran and keep stability in the rest of the region?
The answer, of course, is no. And I think the most important part of that is Iran does not want to change any of its actions. And with hard negotiations and consistent sanctioning, Iran is willing to change a few things, or at least agree or appear to, while in fact not giving up basically this theocracy that has been a successful dictatorship now for so many decades. And so, one of the challenges is with the sanctions, notwithstanding an actual overthrow of the theocracy, which I do not predict is easily gotten, no matter who's in the White House. But when you look and say, well, will they change anything now? Of course not. Once the sanctions are being lifted, not only will they engage in their nuclear ambitions, because that's the greatest, if you will, safety net for their regime, but they're going to have the money to re-energize their stranglehold on what's left in Lebanon, and there isn't much after the financial collapse. And they desperately want to solidify their relationship and their hold on Syria, one which is still tenuous. Most people don't understand how tenuous the Alawite government is, and how dependent they are not just on Iranian militias, but on Russian support. And so if you look at their pathway to the Mediterranean, they absolutely were going to lose that if Trump got another 4 years. Now they have a likelihood, and their highest priority will be making sure that they have a clear, usable land bridge from Iran to the Mediterranean. And when we look at their long-term ambitions beyond Shia-dominated countries, when they pop off from Lebanon, they're going to begin endangering countries or destabilizing countries in Europe. And I think for our European colleagues, this is one of the challenges is it doesn't take a lot of Hezbollah sympathetic believers that have immigrated to European countries to begin making a real adverse difference in the politics and in the safety of those countries. And so just as we've seen it in Brazil in small ways and some other countries in South America, if they have that stability to the Mediterranean, they now have free flow of the support people, Iranian-backed, typically Arabs with family, in Europe, South America, or the United States. And that's where we were heading before the last 4 years, and it's where we're heading back to.
Yeah, that's the sense that I've been getting as well. I do want to do something now, Congressman. I'm told that we have you for about 35, 40 minutes. Is that correct?
Yes, I was originally going to be coming on now, so you certainly have me for a while, and you'll lose me mostly because United Airlines is not sympathetic to voice over IP calls.
Uh-huh. Thank you. So I say that because before I ask you that because before we move on to questions, I think it's very important that we hear from Derk Eppink and his remarks in particular, because he's your European counterpart on this, and I want to hear what he has to say, and then I'm sure that he has that you may have a comment for him or he may have a comment for you.
Oh, absolutely. Once an American says they're coming for you, you have to give them a chance to say, yes, we know.
Exactly. So we have with us. Let me just give a quick intro so everybody knows. Derk Eppink is as I mentioned earlier, an honorary distinguished fellow of the Gold Institute, somebody who has been very interested in transatlantic relations, and was certainly an integral part in the creation of the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Derk is the vice chair in the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs. He sits in the delegation for relations with the United States. He's on the committee for budgets, the committee on budgetary controls, and the committee on women's rights and gender equality. I would say maybe that Derk, you and the congressman can get together and talk about balanced budgets if you're both on those appropriate committees. If it doesn't work here, it might not. Maybe the Europeans can help us. Derk, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Eli. Well, to look at the relationship between the EU and the US after the elections, there was a big sigh of relief of the European Commission, in particular, that Mr. Biden had won the elections, or at least became the next president. Mrs. von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, said famously in the European Parliament, "We have a friend in the White House." So the previous 4 years, they regarded the president as an enemy to them. So what does the Commission of the EU and the new incumbency of Democrats have in common? Well, first of all, they are glad and relieved that the big Satan is gone. What is their ideological glue? That's first of all multilateralism. So the idea that all problems can be solved through international organizations, conferences, and so on. Secondly is globalism, international trade agreements, particularly with China. And thirdly, there's a sense of moralism, lecturing countries all over the world on what to do and showing themselves as the example to the world. But if you look at the policy of the current president, the first thing that strikes is the quick return to the Iran deal. I was really amazed by that. It was if President Biden immediately went back to a sort of a Obama 03, in which he basically recognized the nuclear deal with Iran as the new starting point. So as a result, the Abraham Accords are very important for the Middle East, and particularly because it puts Israel in a political and diplomatic network, in which it is not isolated anymore, but can operate in the Middle East very positively at danger, because strengthening and emboldening Iran means and at the same time undermining Saudi Arabia means that the relation of power is going to shift again in the wrong direction. So this is a very bad thing. But it strengthens the view of the EU, because the EU regards itself as the last protector of the Iran deal. The Obama government, because they didn't want to take too much credit for this agreement in Washington, he couldn't get it through the Congress. They said it was all due to Europe, that it had been achieved, and the European negotiations were so good, and they had done it. But obviously, behind the scene, the Americans were calling the shots. But the EU regards the Iran deal as one of the achievements of their diplomacy, of which they have very few, actually. Recently, we witnessed a complete dress down of the foreign representative of the EU in Moscow. Now, I think this is a very important point. As regards China, well, you see, the US is much more critical of China, has become much more critical in the past 4 years, and the current government cannot shy away from it. In Europe, it's slightly different. The former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd recently said in a meeting we had that China regards Europe as a swing state, as an area that can go either ways, sort of the Ohio, if this still is a swing state, of the world in the view of China. China can intrude. Europe doesn't know exactly what to say, where to stand. It has all sorts of relations with China, obviously. The economic relations are most important at the moment. It doesn't know what to say about the Uyghurs and other issues. And so here we have got China that is able to push through in Europe, because it doesn't know what to think. In 20 years ago, when China entered the WTO, the Europeans thought that China will become like us. They will become a sort of Europeans living in Asia. Well, that didn't really happen with a civilization of 5,000 years. That's quite obvious. And so now China is putting its national interest first, is pushing for it, and Europe does not have any reply. So here again, it is going to be, I think, slightly difficult for the United States to keep Europe on board, since this is a swing state. You never know what direction it is going. One thing that will stay, I think, is the reluctance of the Europeans to spend more money on NATO. They will say, well, we have yet another crisis, we have no money, we're not going to do it. So President Biden will have the same problems here in this issue than his predecessor had. And so that problem will simply linger on. So that's what I had to say.
Thank you, Dirk. Dirk, do you believe that this Biden administration will be more receptive to a European military than the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think so. They will probably have the same sort of approach of supporting the EU, creating its own army, which is called the European Army. Jeffrey Van Orden, who is also in the conversation, knows a lot about it. I also know how much he detests this idea. So do I, because basically it is it's
Dirk,
a French.
Dirk, I think we're losing you.
It is a French aspiration, the capitals of the member states, and to put some effort in the so-called European army, in which the predecessor didn't really think highly about it, because he knew what a paper tiger is all about.
Understood. I want to add, Dirk, do you have any comments for the congressman or vice versa?
Well, I would like to know how this policy with regard to Iran will continue, and whether there is any opposition from democratic members of Congress to this, because it is endangering the position of the Arab nations around in the Gulf area, and particularly of Israel, because the Abraham Accords were one of the big achievements of the previous president. And I think that has to be recognized as such. And it seems that the Democrats, as the congressman said, whatever Trump did was bad. Now, not everything was bad. Many things were quite good. I think most of the things he did were quite good. You can differ about his style and all the other things, but generally he had big achievements in foreign policy, and this is one of the most prominent of them.
The important thing is we haven't tested the Democratic vote yet, and we will be testing it shortly in a number of ways, including State Department authorization. And as we do that, I think we'll get a feeling for whether people like Senator Menendez of New Jersey and others, who, rolled over the first time because it was a non-vote, but now are going to find themselves having real challenges to the re-engagement.
Understood.
So,
Congressman, I'm going to throw it at you. Do you have anything for Dirk?
Yeah, I think the question is, with the Europeans generally being more engaging on the Palestinians without reform, but with the what's happened with the Abraham Accords, how are they going to view when they have so many of the Arab countries coming in and basically saying, look, we don't care about that issue anymore.
Yes, that's right. I mean,
is that going to move that relationship?
Well, I would hope so, because the EU diplomacy is very much focusing on what is called Palestinian issue, and particularly the Palestinians as regarded, broadly spoken, as the victims of Israeli policies. But in fact, if you look at the Arab world, Arab countries are basically pushing the Palestinians aside and going for more realistic policies with regard to Israel and the entire environment. Is that a lesson? No. The European, you have to know that some European countries have a strong Muslim voting capacity. Yes?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the question?
Repeat that last point.
Yes, I'll do so. One of the reasons why certain countries will not move to a more pro-Israel stance is because there is a big Muslim part of the voter capacity. For example, in France, but also in Sweden, these countries have become very hostile to Israel because of the immigration waves they experienced. In Sweden, particularly after 2015, in France, it has always been more or less like this. But the presence of many Muslims from North African and Middle Eastern countries in Western Europe also shapes the view on Israel and the Palestinian issue as one of the issues where you really have to look for a balance. So, unfortunately, I have to say this is a change which is a product of the changes of the composition in the electorate that most of our countries in Western Europe have experienced. In Eastern Europe, that is not the case. It's rather the opposite. And that's one of the reasons why Israel has the best relations with countries in Eastern Europe.
And I appreciate that. My question was a little bit more nuanced, and maybe unknown at this point. But it's as we look at Arab nations, Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, and the expanding beyond just little Jordan and Egypt, these countries, as their relations improve, the question is, will they be able to pull off these expatriates and have them say that's not our issue? Because when we actually look at the Palestinian population, it's a relatively small part of the population that's sympathetic historically in Europe. As a matter of fact, if you look, you realize that there are a huge amount of non-Arab Muslims, including Turks, who are part of that immigrant population, and especially when you look at the North Africans. And so that becomes the question: is if at some point Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, all of North Africa, including Sudan, of course, if they all have better relations, is there, from a European reflection of their electorate, if that group sees the Palestinians as the Palestinians' problem and not Israel as an enemy of all Arabs and Muslims, do we have leverage in Europe to change the way the European parliaments treat treat Israel? Because if it's purely anti-Semitic, or if it's like France, where there's almost open hostility among non-Arabs and Muslims, that's going to take a long time. But when I look at the expatriates and ask, well, if they start saying we just don't care about that issue, will the electorate be reflected in the members of parliament?
Yes, well, that should be a point, and must certainly be a point to bring forward in European politics, because of the fact that one can say, as you do, that many countries in the Middle East have changed their position towards Israel, and as a result, the European countries should have a different take or view on what's going on in Israel and the Palestinian issue. It may take some time, but it is obviously delayed by the composition of the electorate. And certainly when there are very narrow margins in electability of parties or presidents or prime ministers or whatever, they have to take into account the Muslim vote. And if they do not, like for example, in the UK, you have this situation. You've got it in France, you have it in Germany, you have it in the Netherlands, where you have a Turkish Islamist party represented in the parliament and elected by Turks voters that are strongly anti-Israel. And so I think it will take some time, but the argument should be made by centrist and centrist right parties to convince the people that the world in the Middle East has changed, and there's a new relation of power, and Israel is one of the players in the Middle East, together with Arab countries. So thank you for the argument. We try to make it, but I think certainly after some time it will trickle down in the minds of many citizens that the situation has changed, and Israel is one of the partners with Arab countries.
I want to go back to Nahro Zagros and see Dr. Zagros was born in Iraqi Kurdistan in 1974. Did his doctorate from York University in the UK. He was the vice president of Saran University, the largest public university in Kurdistan, or in the Kurdistan region. Now, I understand that there are about 30 universities, so it's not as if it's just the only university in Kurdistan for us Westerners. but I was actually proud to be a senior fellow at the Iran University as well. His research includes Middle Eastern politics, cultural anthropology, terrorism, and counterterrorism. And Nahro is a senior fellow at the Gold Institute for International Strategy. Nahro, the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks very much. And I apologize in advance if I cough in between my talk and if my sound is not clear. I'm just recovering from COVID. Anyway, it's great to be with you. Good afternoon from Kurdistan, part of Iraq. So yes, one of the things I'm looking for White House's approach and policy towards the Middle East. And so far, I'm afraid we have only seen some tentative attempts, so far there's been very few indications way Washington and the White House will deal with the Middle East in the next 4 years during Biden administration. We have only heard a few things from the White House. One is the war in Yemen, not supporting the Saudi-led operation in Yemen, but also freezing the arm deal with to the region. And a few days ago, this damning report about Khashoggi's murder by the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. We haven't had other issues from the White House in great details regarding ongoing problems in the Middle East, one of which is Iraq, the future of US presence in Iraq, US military in Iraq. We haven't heard anything regarding Turkey and the Angelic base, the US Angelic base in Turkey. We haven't had great details about US policy in Syria, in northern Syria, and how they are going to deal with Iranians in Syria, as well as the Russians and the Turks in that small space. We haven't heard anything regarding the impasse between Palestine and Israel. And we haven't heard anything regarding the future of US military in Afghanistan, which, according to the deal, was made by President Trump. US military, the US personnel and military will withdraw from Afghanistan in May. And we think this is not going to happen straight away, not in May, maybe a few months after that. Anyhow, but what we are looking for a very firm and very strong leadership from the White House, because the relating problems in the region are growing faster and getting out of hands. There is lack of leadership here. There is lack of decisiveness from the European and Western point of view. US allies in the region are looking for a better, stronger America to deal with the pressing issues, and enemies of America are trying to get rid of America in the region altogether. A few days ago, regarding the Iran deal, for example, the spokesperson for the Iranian foreign ministry said they don't see the time is appropriate to hold informal talks with Europeans and Americans regarding the JCPOA, unless America is going to lift the sanctions, and then they will come and negotiate with America. But also knowing that in next few months there's an election in Iran, and the hardliners are in line to get into power. So the tension is rising. That's why we need American leadership. There are pressing issues in Iraq. For example, the Iraqi parliament a few months ago, the lawmakers decided to forcibly throw out Americans in the country. This is the words they use, throwing out Americans in the country. So what's Biden going to do with that? Because Iraq is, again, a strong geopolitical country in the region. And also there are ongoing problems in the region. So, but all of that tells us that Biden and his administration sees the Middle East as not their priority. It's not even their top 3 priorities, because we've heard a lot from the White House about, regarding Europe, regarding Asia Pacific and also the Western Hemisphere, but not much about the Middle East. The only thing that Biden said in the first 2 weeks in his presidency is that he's going to renegotiate the JCPOA and the Iran deal with the Iranians, and he's going to pursue, in his words, diplomatic relations. And he's going to use diplomacy with Iran. But knowing that Iran, going back to the same JCPOA, neither the Middle Eastern, the allies of America, nor the Europeans want to go back to the same deal as before. Leave all other things to the Iranians, all the matters to the Iranians, one of which is the missile program, but also Iranian interference in the region, to leave that to the Iranians, because under the JCPOA, Iran had lots of freedom to create proxies in the Middle East, to intervene in Iraqi politics, in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in other places, in Palestine. So this is not going to be an interesting issue for the new prime minister. We also want to hear whether Biden is going to pursue the same strategy as predecessor Barack Obama, or he's going to come up with new strategies regarding the Middle East. I'm afraid so far we haven't had great details into all these things, but we are anxiously waiting. American friends are anxiously waiting to see decisiveness from the White House and leadership in the region. And so far there is very
I suspect, Nahro, I suspect that you already gave us the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it to you. Is there, at the beginning, after President Biden, or after Joe Biden won the election, he was president-elect, there was cautious optimism in the region, in Iraq, and in the region. Well, specifically within Iraq. Has that dissipated?
Not altogether. Bearing in mind, this is a president who knows the Middle East very well, more than any other president in the past 40 years. He has been in the region so many times, and he knows Iraq for better than any other presidents in history. But not coming up with ideas how to deal with the pressing issues, with the continuing issues, it's a sign of worrying for the allies of America in the region, mainly the Kurds, because this is a guy in 2007 came up with the proposal to partition Iraq into 3 states. But also, just a reminder to everyone, in 1991, he voted against the Iraq invasion and the Gulf War. But this is a different story. But in 2007, he proposed to partition Iraq into 3 states. This is he going to bring back this proposal on the table? Is he going to negotiate with the allies? This proposal, going to negotiate the proposal with the allies in the region? We don't know. We Kurds have lots of hope that this president can see the problems very sensibly, and also to bring in leadership. But so far, like I said, we haven't had anything, we haven't seen, or we have only had a few things, but albeit very tentatively. Only a few days ago, when Americans came under attack in my city where I live, only a few miles from me, American military and personnel came under Iranian attack committed by the proxies of Iran. But 4 days ago, President Biden decided to retaliate with an airstrike in Syria, targeting the militias who were behind the attack, the missile attack to Erbil. So this is very good, but also knowing that Bernie Sanders and Tim Kaine, 2 days ago, they came out furiously against the decision. They said such action should be made in Congress, not by the president. So it seems that he's also going to fight with his own political people from his own political party about this democratic way of dealing with these issues, whether he has the power to retaliate straight away when he sees danger, or whether he's going to go to Congress all the time for any action.
Thank you.
People have some hope because he knows the region. People see him as a sensible leader, but so far they haven't seen anything concrete.
And that argument between Congress and the White House is something that happens every time that there is any military action. It's always that's an ongoing debate as to whether it comes from whether the president has authority or he has to come from Congress. Let's stay in Kurdistan. Rahim Rashidi has a question. Let's go to Rahim. And then Jeffrey Van Orden.
Good morning. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Gold, for holding this great conversation. And hello, Nahro.
Hello.
Let me start by today is the 42nd memorial date of great leadership, Mullah Mustafa Barzani death. As the U.S. consulate in Erbil has had a statement about this memorial and said, always we miss him and we continue his legacy. As you know, U.S. facing many serious challenges in the Middle East. How would you describe Biden response on 25th February, Iranian proxy border between Syria and Iraq? And in general, what are differences between President Trump and President Biden's policy on the Kurds and on the allies, U.S. allies on the region?
Rahim, who was that question? Is that for Nahro or is that for the Congressman?
For both, and first for Congressman, of course. And I would like to invite him to be our guest at the K24 as well. Please.
Congressman?
Well, I look forward to the visit. Please, after this, talk to my office for details of scheduling. But here's perhaps the most bipartisan thing you're going to hear out of me today in the Biden administration. I agree that on some issues, and the entire subject of Kurds and Kurdistan, including how we treat Turkey, there's an opportunity. And I would say that everyone who's impatient to get a decision from the Biden administration misses the most important point. The early decisions have all been to undo whatever Trump did. And what we really want is that thoughtful initiative that doesn't get said very loudly. A decision to enhance support for the Kurdish region, a decision to push back more strongly against Turkey, even though they're a NATO ally. Those decisions are best done in what they said decades ago under Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly and carry a big stick. We have levers that can be effective that we should be using, just as, you know, when Biden says that he wants a diplomatic solution with Iran, the amazing thing is we've had a diplomatic solution. Sanctions are a factor in diplomacy, just as bilateral and multilateral sanctions are, and vice versa. You can also give benefit, but the stick of diplomacy is being shunned by the rest of the world if you don't change your behavior. And certainly Iraq wants to be a part of a global society, as does Iran, and both of them need to have those levers used. So in my case, having had a strong relationship with Vice President Biden and some with him as senator, I would hope that he's listening to some of his colleagues and friends in the Senate who are much more nuanced in how we could approach it, rather than simply, well, whatever Trump did, we'll do something different. But and here's the but I think we all have to understand, the complexity of the mess that we have made over a generation in Iraq, starting with the post-1991 situation relative to the Northern Alliance, all the way through today, actually makes everything more difficult, because all the opportunities for a clear break, such as partitioning Iraq and similar to what happened under the Brits with India and Pakistan, those days are probably, as far as doing it cleanly, are behind us. And now we have to find better solutions that I don't think are as clear. So I hope that's a clear answer. It's not intended to be diplomatic. I just simply think that Biden has to work behind the scenes for a while rather than make some proclamation that undoubtedly he won't be able to keep.
Yes, I'm going to echo what Congressman said and also add a few things. What we observed last week during this missile attack against Americans in Erbil in Iraqi Kurdistan was a direct attack to America by Iranians trying to test America prior to the negotiation in Europe regarding the JCPOA and the Iran deal. So Iran is winning this war. When this is tit for tat in Iraq, it's winning it. When it's a full-scale war, it's losing it. So Iran is using that. But also, what was very helpful was the following action by America when President Biden decided to launch an airstrike against the militias behind the attack. So that was very helpful. But what's happening in Iraq, what's making the life of Americans, but all American allies, more complex and difficult in Iraq is the Iran. When you add Iran to the equation, everything becomes very difficult in Iraq. So while we are trying to pursue diplomacy with Iran, we have to bear in mind that Iran cannot be given all this freedom to operate the way they operate in Iraq and the way they've been operating since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and also do the same thing what they are doing in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and other places. Otherwise, any deal with Iran, it will be very difficult for the American allies to digest, not just the Kurds, but also for the Saudis, for the Israelis, for the UAE, for Bahrain, and other places. So while so many people in America, but also in the papers that I read in Europe and in America, mainly by the left wings, they are hopeful of the diplomacy and Iranian deal. I have difficulties to understand, to agree that America and Europe is going to make a deal with Iran and go back to the same JCPOA, mainly for many reasons, but two amazing reasons. One of which is the allies in the region, American allies in the region, are no longer going to stay and watch the Americans and Europeans make a deal with Iran without raising their concerns. The second one, Europeans are no longer in agreement to go back to the same deal, neither the Americans. So I don't think this agreement, this JCPOA is going to happen. There are also other factors like the Iran election in a few months, who is going to be in power, whether they will agree to go back to the negotiation or not. Just to go back on what I said earlier, only 2 days ago, the spokesperson for the foreign ministry denounced the idea of holding an informal meeting in Europe regarding the JCPOA. So he said Iran's statement is, this is a very solid statement, there's going to be no negotiation until the sanctions are lifted. So it's extremely, extremely complicated for Europe and America to go back to the same agreement. And what Rahim Rashidi said, just briefly, about Kurdistan, I think we see ourselves as allies of the United States, but also all other people in the region, all other countries in the region will say the same thing, that the Kurds are the most trusted allies of the United States in the region. So that's why we need firm policy towards Kurdistan and firm policy towards enhancing what we have achieved here for the past 30 years in this region, which is becoming the most democratic and most economically viable and and prosperous place in the whole region. And I hope America is going to help that and help bring more help to the Kurds to enhance what they have achieved here.
Thank you, Nahro. We have Congressman. We have two questions that are going to be very, very brief. Do you have time for those?
Yes, United is giving me time at the gate, so I'm here.
Excellent. Let me go to my colleague at the Institute, a distinguished fellow, the Honorable Jeffrey Van Orden. Jeffrey, if we can, we're going to make all these questions brief and.
Yeah, okay. Eli, thank you so much. And very good to see you all. Good morning. Congressman, thank you so much. The trouble is, of course, we've got to live with this administration now for a number of years. And of course, you have a Congress which is not balanced in the way that you would like. I just want to ask you, what is your appreciation, Congressman Issa, what is your appreciation of the Democrats in Congress at the moment? What proportion of them are what I would call foreign policy realists? And what proportion of them do you think are just left ideologically driven Democrats? Because it seems to me that there is the possibility for creating new, useful political way forward over the next sort of few years?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think in the House, particularly, the left is in control of much of the agenda. What makes that different relative to foreign policy is that as long as we hold the vast majority, if not unity among Republicans, with a 5-vote swing in the overall House and a 2-vote swing in the Foreign Affairs Committee, you really only have to say, you know, are there half a dozen for the full House or more who are stridently opposed to going in the wrong direction or willing to ask for some change in foreign policy or some maintenance, and are willing to unite with Republicans, not because of Trump or because of Biden, but because of the policy. And that starts on the committee. The Foreign Affairs Committee has historically, on some of these issues, had Friends of Kurdistan, has had very strong friends of Israel, but also friends of some of our moderate Arab nations. And disproportionately versus the whole House, Democrats have been willing to say that Iran is on the wrong track. And I'll just give you one quick example. Juan Vargas, who is a progressive Democrat, was once becoming a priest. He's very, very liberal. But he voted against JCPOA. He's moved up in seniority on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he has a strong voice. So with the kind of discussion we're having today, you're in a position to say, not only will his voice be heard, but new members like Congresswoman Jacobs and so on, who are new to the committee and haven't been defined. I think we have a golden opportunity not to buck the administration, but to buck those in the Congress who might be willing to rubber stamp bad ideas.
Yeah.
Let me, we have John Rappaport.
Hi, gentlemen. First, thank you for some really terrific points. And Congressman Issa, I want to thank you on behalf of my partner, Bart Shields. You recommended his daughter, who now has a scholarship, full scholarship to the Merchant Marine Academy. So kudos to you. Question's pretty brief. So clearly, you know, you guys just scratched the surface in the cascading impact of bad foreign policy. But Congressman, party polarization seems to completely trump national security. As a sort of an extension to Jeffrey's question, is there any effort in Congress to try to build back a coalition? I harken back to the almost dying, dead or dying breed of blue dog Democrats, so that at least forget all the domestic nonsense. National security is the one thing we all desperately need for you folks to do well. Is there any effort underway, that you could speak to?
Well, I know Trent Franks is, as an outsider, looking at this every day and wondering where the Jane Harmons are. And the answer is they're a think tank. They're gone. It is one of the challenges on foreign policy, finding moderate Democrats and picking them off, not necessarily moderate in any other way, but moderate on those issues, is doable. And it's one of the reasons I enjoy being on foreign affairs. When you look at actual national security hawks in the spirit of Jane Harman, who will put country first, it's much harder, although there are a few over on the Armed Services Committee, and it is an ongoing problem. You know, one of the challenges is the America First agenda of the president. If you bring it up, it polarizes. So the first thing you have to do is not bring it up, not argue over whether negotiations and working with our allies, multilateral is somehow abandoning America First. And that means you have to soften the Republican message when you're actually trying to reach out to what few members are left on the other side that will, in fact, put the best interest globally, but do it from an American perspective.
So thank you, Congressman. In true Washingtonian form, while I said that was the last question, I'm going to see if United will allow me to ask you one more question. You sit on the subcommittee for human rights, if I'm not mistaken, and I also believe that you sit there with your colleague Ilhan Omar. But anyway, interesting. The question I have is, do you see a possibility that that human rights will be a key part in the Democrat foreign policy? In other words, let me give an example to better articulate my question. When you take countries like Egypt, for example, would you see, or could you see, Democrats using human rights against what they perceive as human rights violations against journalists and so on as a key point or a starting point for relations with countries like Egypt?
Well, they already have, and you're hitting a very good point. For decades, we talked about the Copts, the Coptics, and so on being somehow part of our human rights agenda. That's gone away, mostly because they're pretty happy with President Sisi and so on. And you're seeing the same thing for other minorities in Egypt. But you're exactly right. When you have somebody who puts the word journalism, not politician, and not Islamist, but they put that there, and then they get sideways with the government. They're always going to claim that it's human rights. And so there is a fine line. One of the challenges, though, in Egypt, and I spent a lot of time on Egypt, and always have, is you can't avoid the fact that the Egyptians are very thin-skinned when it comes to actually taking criticism. And so there has to be some pushback, and that's where there's middle ground. I chose to give up being on the Middle East subcommittee, not because I don't plan on traveling, but because the human rights issue, I think, for both Africa and the Middle East is going to be one where we can come together. I'm not going to buy into some of the Democrats' priorities, but there are some common grounds we can have. And I would say, relative to any member of the committee, I was on the Helsinki Commission with Elsie Hastings, and one would say that Elsie and I have nothing in common. But you can find, when you're dealing with human rights, you can find ways to say, why don't we work on these issues where we could both agree that these are priorities of human rights? And that just means you sit silent when they go off on everything else that they will make as human rights violations, including the very existence of the State of Israel or questions of women's rights throughout the region. Those things aren't going away, but they're just not the ones where we're going to cross over and say, here we have atrocities being Eritrea, whatever the issue in the region is, we're going to find some common ground. I'm going to have to go. I appreciate so much not only your questions, but how generous you've all been with your time. And I look forward to doing this again in the future.
Thank you very much for joining us, Congressman. This was truly an honor, and I look forward to our next one. But I thank everybody for joining us. I thank you, Nahro, Zagros, for joining us and spending as much time with us as you have. Even though I know that at the beginning we were troubled with some technical difficulties. This is been a fantastic and I think an enlightening conversation, one that can certainly go on for several hours more. I thank everybody for joining us today, and also want to encourage you to join us tomorrow as we discuss the state of law enforcement in the United States right now. I suspect that this is an issue that has taken global attention, and I would encourage you to join us tomorrow as we have a great lineup. Well, with that, I thank everybody for joining us. And if you have any, if you want to read our articles or learn more about the Gold Institute, certainly go visit goldiis.org. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.